All right, please pray with me. Spirit, we are your people. Feed us, minister to us according to our needs. May only truth be spoken, may only truth be heard, we ask. Amen. What is to keep me from being baptized? Christianity emerged from a brown man whose country was regularly taken over by other countries who were happy to turn them into slaves. He was someone who brought good news to losers, brought good news to those who were treated unfairly, brought good news to those who always felt like the deck was stacked against them. Of course, I'm talking about Jesus, and when this Jesus movement took off after his death, it became a multilingual, multicultural, multiracial movement with the universal value of peace based on justice, not based on violence. And it became a growing universal following. Imagine way back then, the followers of Jesus coming up with the Bible verse of the month that we just said together. There is no Jew, no Greek, no black, no white, no male, no female. Think about that. Back over 2,000 years ago. It's unbelievable what Spirit can do and is doing. But 400 years after Jesus, when the Emperor of Rome decided to make Christianity its official religion, and it tore down all the beautiful pagan temples and used the material to erect Christian churches. And when it made Christian leaders part of the white European ruling class, Christianity changed from a movement to emancipate slaves to a movement to support owning slaves. That's pretty brutal. In England, Spain, France, Italy, Germany, America, Canada, all these empires made their fortunes stealing from other countries because they had the biggest guns. We had the biggest guns. And this new twisted Christianity justified doing this in the name of saving heathen Africans and heathen indigenous peoples in Canada from witchcraft. That's what I remember hearing growing up. And it was called the divine right of discovery. Whatever you discovered of somebody else's territory, you could take. And the empires would help you as long as you paid your fair share. Now, our stories from Acts celebrate the growing earlier Jesus love movement of peace through justice rather than violence. And it heralds the very opposite, a universal vision of dignity. Dignity for everyone as a part of God's creation. Remember last week's story? As the disciples were starting to realize that while Jesus' body wasn't with them, his spirit was, and the movement could continue. And it talks about how people in Jerusalem who'd come to the Pentecost celebrations and who were there on business too, how they began to understand this new vision of a world not run by dictators and not run by the greed of emperors and empires, but a new vision of a world run according to fairness and fair laws. And they began to get it in their own language, and they went home and applied it in their own cultures. When Christianity finally went west, it totally integrated with paganism. That was the great, amazing feature, that Christianity wasn't rooted so much in the particular doctrines, but in this vision. And now we look today at a black man, the chief of staff for the First Lady of Ethiopia, Queen Candace. And the Spirit sends Philip his way. Now, Philip didn't know why he has to take a desert road to Gaza. And he sure doesn't know why he has to go to Gaza, let alone take the road that the text points out nobody travels anymore. I don't know, maybe it must have a lot of potholes, probably longer. They must have put in a new express route. But the Spirit's telling Philip, no, you got to go this way. And you know, that's so much life in the Spirit, isn't it? We get a hunch, we need to do something, or we start taking a course or going to university or college. We're not sure how it's all going to work out, but we're following the leading of Spirit as best we can. Investing in a business, and then it runs into trouble with COVID coming. we don't even know whether we can continue. Sometimes we get an urge to call somebody we haven't talked to for years. We need to be open to Spirit. Because when we do whatever we face, even if it's a difficult thing, if we do it out of the spirit of love, good will come from it. That's how Spirit operates. There's a lot of desert roads that Spirit leads us down. But Philip, he goes with the Spirit, and he's there to run into the eunuch. This Ethiopian eunuch. All first ministers to the queen were eunuchs. And he was the first minister. He was the head chief of staff. This powerful, wealthy, accomplished black man was in Jerusalem on business. And he heard about Jesus. And he heard about this man who God was anointing and had anointed and was continuing to work through people. And he was given a copy of Isaiah because there was no New Testament then. It hadn't been written yet. And so he's reading this passage of Isaiah, another brown man, who wrote this passage referring to himself and other faithful leaders. And this is the way, unfortunately, through life, that it often comes with sacrifice. And so he's reading from Isaiah. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. He was like a sheep that is silent when its wool is cut off. He didn't open his mouth. When he humbled himself, he was not judged fairly. Who from his generation will talk about his life on earth being cut short? You know, as I was reading that in light of this past week, sounds like George Floyd, doesn't it? This Ethiopian was wondering who this passage applied to, and he asked Philip. And so Philip started with Isaiah's story of how Isaiah and the other prophets had to face evil and were persecuted. But somehow they overcame it, and the vision stayed alive. And then he told them about Jesus, who was even killed, but who the Spirit couldn't be stopped. And the vision was still alive. And this leader of the royal household gets it. He wants to be a part of the movement. He sees this vision of a world where we live by just laws. And so he said, well, there's some water here. Is there any reason why I can't get baptized? He's not really asking for permission, but he's learned it's good to check things out. And so this is the good news. Philip says, no, let's do this. Let's do this thing. And the good news is not that you're sinful and need to bow to some authority for God to accept you. No, the good news is we're co-creators with God. And that we're welcome. We are all a part of God's family. And so there was nothing to block this man from being baptized. There was nothing from blocking him from claiming a new identity as one who's committed to this vision of peace through kindness and justice. There was nothing to block him from sharing in this ministry of the Anointed One and being anointed himself to carry on the ministry of Jesus, as we all are and are anointed in our baptisms. So Philip shakes his head. Yes, let's do it. There's no hidden rules, no doctrinal training necessary, no money to be paid, no special sinner's prayer to be prayed. No, we can just do this. And as children of God, we should all be given that same opportunity. The Ethiopian man discovered in Jesus and that was supported by Philip. The freedom and support to grow up without worrying about the things that should be just given to us. We should all be able to grow up without worrying about where we're going to live and having a nice place to lay our heads, without worrying about how we're going to be fed, without worrying how the police are going to treat us or how the system's going to treat us. Like the Ethiopian, we shouldn't have to beg to be treated fairly. It should be just a part of the privilege that we all share as people of God, not just white privilege. Now, the white privilege word kind of gets us upset because we think, we're not privileged, we've had to work hard. And we have, but however hard white people in this culture have worked, it's just that people of color have an extra problem we don't have. And we don't want people to have an extra problem. We want the privilege of God's creation to be shared amongst all God's children. What's to keep me from being baptized, from claiming my name? What's to keep me from claiming the life I've been divinely anointed to have? It should be nothing. But it doesn't always work that way. The man in the video we saw, if he had asked the family for a glass of water, let alone baptism, help with baptism before they knew he was the bone marrow donor, they would have just said no. They obviously didn't like it. Thankfully, we don't have that kind of racism in our community in Mount Zion and in Trinity. Now, it does appear in people from time to time, but racists don't feel comfortable around it. And that's a great thing. But like everybody else, London has its history of racism. By the 1850s, London was an active little city that was home to some of the richest black settlers in Ontario, many who'd come through the Underground Railroad as slaves. But ex-slave, a doctor, Alfred T. Jones, said that in London, this is way back in the day, said this, there was a mean prejudice that couldn't even be found in the States. By 1863, London was planning segregated schools, but then they didn't have enough funds to do it. The Ku Klux Klan made their great debut in London in 1872. A decade later, they burned down a black man's house, Richard Harrison. There's always been a white supremacist core in London. They were at the protest yesterday, yelling, "Go home, go home, go home." In fact, I found it interesting when I came to Trinity and started to talk to the elder members. The leader of the Ontario white supremacists came to Trinity with his wife and daughter a generation ago. The older member told me that the elders met around it and said if he starts talking about his white supremacy, we're going to ask him not to come. But he never did say boo, so he came here for over 10 years. And the white supremacist group Northern Alliance was formed in London in 1997, and it's still active today. But more relevant to us is a story that I remember when my son brought his friends over to the house one day in grade 8. They were supposed to be at a party around the corner, and so I came down the basement, and I said, guys, how come you're not at the party? There was a big silence. And then finally my son said, her dad wouldn't allow Dane to stay because he's black. And so we decided none of us would stay. Say, that's the way to be. That's the way to be an ally. But that's what happens regularly in life, yes, even in Canada and here in London. Now, one of those friends that was with Jackson down in the basement that day has become a son of ours. And he notices that when he goes into stores, that often clerks will follow him around to make sure he doesn't steal in a way that my son Jackson doesn't experience. That's systemic racism. Now, that word systemic is important for us to get, because the problem is that us white people, we often get feeling defensive and guilty, and that's crazy. If you're not racist, if you want the best for everybody, then you're not a racist. So systemic means you're not the problem, okay? You didn't create and do the terrible things that's happened in the past. So give yourself a break. Don't feel guilty, but don't feel defensive. Don't feel brittle about it. Say, okay, I'm not racist, but I need to learn. I need to learn how to help those who are not being treated properly. That's our job, not to be defensive. So don't feel guilty about things you haven't done. Don't get defensive when we talk about systemic racism. We're talking about you. We're talking about a system. The clerks who follow my brown son around, they've caught people of color stealing before. But they've also caught white people stealing before. But as a white person, a person of color stands out. So they focus on them in a way they don't focus on the white people. That's how it works. My black son has seen some police rough up black and brown folk here in London when he lived in a low-income project. And it's not just American people of color, parents of color, who have to give their children, especially their sons, the talk. The talk is, if the police stop you, never argue with them. If they're wrong, never say so. Come home later, and we can always do a complaint. Never keep your hands where they can't see them. Always be compliant. Never, never talk back, because you may be beat up, you may be killed. That's the talk that black parents and people of color all across Canada still have to give their sons. That's systemic racism. White kids can give police lip and have less chance of being beat up. Although the poorer they are, the more chance the police will go after them. Because this isn't just racism, it's classism. White children of middle class and rich kids can get away with a lot of lip without being beat up or sent to jail. I've gotten away with arguing with the police that if I was black, may well have triggered a policeman to make my life miserable in some way. And police and district attorneys in Canada don't send white kids to prison for using drugs, but they send tons of Aboriginal and colored people to prison for using drugs. I'm not talking about dealing drugs, I'm talking about simple possession. It's not a conscious thing. Most cops and district attorneys and juries aren't thinking, well, let's put some black people away today. But it happens. CBC did a thorough study of Canadians killed by the police from 2000 to 2017. It was hard to do because the police don't keep records racially. But black people in Toronto that make up an average of 8% of the population during the 17-year period were 37% of the victims. That's systemic racism. In Winnipeg, Indigenous people represent 10% of the population but account for 60% of the people killed by the police. That's systemic. 5 to 6 times the killing rates of white people by police. That's what Black Lives Matter is trying to change. And it's difficult. You can have a great governor like the governor of Minnesota who gets this and is trying to change things. You can have a great chief of police like the chief of police in Minneapolis that gets this. And he still has officers who killed George Floyd. We've got great police chiefs in Canada. I heard the one from Ottawa, phenomenal. And I knew the former commissioner of the OPP who stood up to the government when they were trying to lower the credentials so that one of the premier's friends could become the commissioner. His life was dedicated to these very issues. And a close friend of mine is one of the four who are in charge just under the commissioner. And it was at that person's inauguration of taking that position that I got to meet and talk with the former commissioner. I mentioned in a reflection this past week the concern of the black community over these things. And it is bedeviling. I mean, you could have Jesus as a commissioner of the police and we still wouldn't get rid of these problems without changing policies. That's what systemic means. Policies have to change. And so the black community, I mentioned in my reflection the death of Regis Kraczynski, who fell from her balcony to her death. I mentioned that her mother said that she was pushed by the police, but later the mother admitted that she didn't see it. And hopefully it'll come out that the police handled that call properly. But it sure begs the question, how does a woman with several officers in the apartment with her end up falling off a balcony? I mean, if this was something unusual, something exceptional, perhaps there'd be a good explanation, but this happens all the time. 5 to 6 times as often as white people, where people get killed when the police show up to help. And it's disturbing to hear that a policeman, against the law, leaked a story to the Sun media to make the police look better, a story that may or may not be true, but makes no sense even if it is. We know that most police are honorable people. Most never use their gun their whole career, which points to the wisdom of having most of the jobs done by the police done by civilians at 40% less cost. Have a reduced uniformed force, highly trained as marksmen, but higher on the basis of their character and their commitment to these issues. Let's put money into making communities stronger and healthier, and return the police to being a police service rather than the police force. We say it's the bad apples that cause the problems, and it is. But here's the question. What do we do with the bad apples? When you and I buy a bag of apples, and there's a bad apple there, we throw out the bad apple. There's the problem. In policing, like the church and a lot of institutions, the bad apples are kept around. I mean, let's look at religion for a moment. 7% of priests in the Roman Catholic Church have been pedophiles. 7%. Did they get rid of them? No. They sent them somewhere else. All the documents the bishops had to send to Rome so that the crown prosecutors couldn't get them. So, this is the problem. We don't deal with the bad apples. And just as we haven't dealt with the bad apples in the church, so too it's almost impossible to get rid of a racist, angry, violent police officer. Most collective agreements allow complaints about a police officer to be stricken from the record in as few as 6 months. Think about that. If someone in the police force uses violence, they don't have to give a report if they don't want to. The regulations say it's because, like all Canadians, they have a right to not say something that might incriminate them. But I want to tell you something. If a complaint is lodged against me, I have to give a report. Now, I may choose not to, but then the church will fire me. Any police officer involved in the use of force who will not give a testimony to the police of what happened should be fired. Doesn't mean they'll be charged criminally. The normal processes will handle that. And also under current regulations, the officers who witnessed the event, they do have to give a statement. But guess what? They get to hang together and meet with a lawyer before they make a statement. Wonderful opportunity to make up a story. It's got to stop. If I'm charged in the United Church of Canada, everyone will be asked individually, including me, what happened, and we are told to not discuss it with anybody else. That's the way it should be. The system must be changed. The system must be cleaned up and made accountable. We've got to get rid of the bad apples that don't besmirch the reputation of the many wonderful people in police services. And it's going to happen. There's a new wind of Pentecost that's rising up. And it's being led by you, just as Joel, thousands of years ago, in our scripture passage last Sunday, predicted it would. He said, God will pour out. God said, I will pour out my spirit on every kind of people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy and they will see visions. And baby, they are. They are seeing visions and they are standing up for that vision. And you know, it's been pointed out by many that the big changes in society are intergenerational, with wise elders advising and supporting, but the young people and the young adults lead the charge. Martin Luther King Jr., he was a young man. Nellie McClung was in her early 30s when she took on the fight for women to get the vote. And later, the women's movement in the 60s, the LGBTQ movement, and today's environmental movement are engaging the youth. And now what we saw in London around the world, another miracle. White and black marching together. There was more white people at the march in London yesterday than were black. Appropriately, because there's more white people in the population. But it was a wonderful thing to see. Wonderful thing to see. We've never seen anything like it before. Even Trump, who's always seemed like Mr. Teflon, untouched by a host of things, any one which would gut another president fired, is now looking scared and weak, and Republicans are getting nervous. Change is coming. Who would have thought that Stockwell Day, a senior cabinet minister in the Harper government, a popular commentator, and a nice man who just doesn't get it, who's always said there's no systemic racism in Canada. Well, he said it again last week, and guess what? The board of TELUS fired him. Another board fired him. The CBC fired him. People are getting it now, even if Stockwell hasn't yet. And he may well. There was a time I didn't get it. I was a racist. I thought Indians were just lazy drunks. Of course, I didn't know what government had done to them. And I changed. We can all change. Who would have imagined that the commissioner of the National Football League would do an about-face and declare that he and the league were wrong to punish players for kneeling on one knee as a call for greater justice? That, my friend, nobody saw coming. It's a miracle. It's a fresh Pentecost miracle. So let's not be guilty or defensive unless we treat others less than us. Let's take the role of allies. Allies with spirit. Allies with all people who are being excluded from their baptismal right to live a full and meaningful life as members of a humane family. When people ask us for baptism, and they ask to come in our spiritual communities at Mount Zion and Trinity, we're just like Philip. Fill your boots. Great to see you. Glad you're here. Welcome home. There's no obstacles for anybody in our communities. Let's make it that way in our society. Like Philip, let's continue being allies to all who are trying to have access to the Canadian dream. Let's work with them until the day comes when there'll be no obstacles to any of us being all we can be. Look, there's some water. What could keep me from being baptized? Not a thing, brother. Not a thing, sister. Help yourself. Let's do the video on how to be an ally.
Hey friends, so I'm trying something different with my setup, and I don't know if it's working, but you will deal. Imagine your friend is building a house, and they ask you to help, but you've never built a house before. So it might be a good idea for you to put on some protective gear and listen to the person in charge. Otherwise, someone's going to get seriously hurt. Look, I'm helping! It's the exact same idea when it comes to being an ally. An ally is a person that wants to fight for the equality of a marginalized group that they're not a part of. We need your help building this house. But you probably should listen so you know what to do first. Let's do this. So here are my 5 tips for being a good ally. Understand your privilege. Now, a lot of people get hung up on the word privilege, so let me break it down for you nice and easy. Privilege does not mean that you are rich, that you have an easy life, that everything's been handed to you and you never had to struggle or work hard. All it means is that there are some things in life that you will not experience or ever have to think about just because of who you are. It's kind of like those horses that have those blinders on. They can see just fine. There's just a whole bunch of stuff on the side that they don't even know exists. So for example, there are currently 29 states where you can legally be fired for being gay, and there are 34 states where you can legally be fired for being trans. Now, as a straight cis woman, those are things that I don't have to ever think about if I don't want to. I'm not going to be fired because I'm straight, and I'm not going to be fired because I'm cis. So it makes sense that before I can fight for the rights of others, I have to understand what rights I have and others don't. That's privilege. Listen and do your homework. It sounds like a no-brainer, but it's not possible for you to learn if you aren't willing to listen. So you gotta know when to zip up the lip up. I don't know. You get what I mean. But that's the thing that's so cool about social media. There are so many people sharing their stories all around the world and connecting with people that they normally would never get a chance to without the power of the internet. So do your homework. Start reading blogs, tweets, news articles, and stories so that you can get caught up on the issues that are important to the communities that you want to support. Speak up. But not over. If the Fight for Equality was a girl group, the ally wouldn't be the lead singer or the second lead singer. They'd be Michigan. An ally's job is to support. You want to make sure that you use your privilege and your voice to educate others, but make sure to do it in such a way that does not speak over the community members that you're trying to support or take credit for things that they are already saying. This isn't Mario Kart. Stay in your lane. Realize that you're going to make mistakes and apologize when you do. Nobody's perfect. Unlearning problematic things takes time and work, so you are bound to mess up and trip and fall. But don't worry, you can brush yourself off and get right back up. I'm back up! Just remember that it's not about your intent, it's about your impact. So when you get called out, make sure to listen, apologize, commit to changing your behavior, and move forward. Last, but certainly not least, actually the most important thing on this list, is remember that ally is a verb. Saying you're an ally is not enough. You gotta do the work. 1 through 4. 1 through 4. As always, there are links in the video description box to some of the things I mentioned in this video, along with some resources that have been really helpful for me as I've gone along in my journey to be more conscious. So I want to hear from you in the comments. What are some sites that you suggest checking out? What are some things that have helped you become a better ally? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you when I see you. Bye!